treasure of 8 gold rings in this linen scarf, but he must have dropped it. Thieves had to work fast in order to avoid the valley's police. We think the first group of robbers got away, but the second gang may not have been so lucky. They could get rich selling their loot, but if they were caught, they faced a terrible penalty. This hieroglyphic symbol shows what happened to them if they got caught. And it stands for the word punishment, and it shows a man impaled on a stake. And it's probably what happened to any tomb raiders they caught. Carter didn't return to the annex for almost 5 years. He had an organized, scientific mind, so he wanted to completely unpack the antechamber before working in another room. But Carter was also fascinated with this one wall you can see here with the 2 statues facing each other, guarding a sealed doorway. He realized that Tut's burial chamber must be behind that door. So after spending 7 weeks clearing the antechamber, he was finally ready to open this very door. When he got through, he discovered a wall of gold, what turned out to be one side of a gilded shrine. It was so huge that it almost filled the entire room. This photo shows the partially uncovered door to the burial chamber. You can see how big the shrine is. Look at the dimensions. Like, it was enormous. This shrine was actually the first of 4 shrines, fitted one inside the other. This shrine is made of cedar wood. It's gilded and inlaid with blue glazed pottery. Here's a detail of the shrine with protective symbols like the Yet symbol. It looks like bunny ears to me. It symbolized the protection of the goddess Isis. And the pillars themselves, they were another symbol. They were supposed to give rebirth and protection to the pharaoh. Tomb robbers had broken the seals on the doors of this shrine. Here's the second shrine. And this one is gilded, and it was decorated with writings from the Book of the Dead. This was a text designed to guide the soul in the afterlife. The doors of the second shrine were still sealed, so Carter knew that the tomb robbers had not reached the king's mummy. Dismantling the shrines was difficult because the space was so tight. Eventually, the shrines had to be taken apart in 51 different pieces and then carried out of the room. When all the shrine doors were open, Carter could see the sarcophagus inside. It was carved from a huge block of quartzite stone, and the winged figure you see here is the goddess Isis. I wasn't aware of how many shrines were used to cover the sarcophagus. Altogether, the shrines, sarcophagus, and coffins totaled 9 in number. But the Egyptians created several layers deliberately to create layers of protection for the mummy. There they are. Carter had to use a system of wires and pulleys to raise the lid of the sarcophagus and the coffins. It was dangerous work in this very tight space. And it was difficult because the 3 coffins and the mummy weighed more than 1.5 tons. After the sarcophagus was lifted, 3 magnificent coffins, one inside the other, protected the mummified body of the pharaoh. The outer coffin, number 1 on the screen, was 7 feet, 4 inches long, with 2 small coffins nestled tightly inside of it. These coffins are 2 and 3 on this slide. Take a look. The outermost coffin was made from gilded cypress wood covered with plaster and gold leaf and decorated with a feather pattern. The second coffin was made of gilded wood, but it was more elaborate than the first, with the distinctive striped headdress, and it was inlaid with red and turquoise glass and blue pottery. Carter was amazed to discover that this inner coffin was made of solid gold. It was about 1/8 inch thick, and it weighed nearly 300 pounds. This coffin housed the mummy of the pharaoh, and it was directly covered by this fabulous golden death mask. In all the coffins, Tutankhamun wore a false beard with an upturned tip as a sign of his divinity. And he carried the crook and the flail in his hands. These were also emblems of his divine rule. And above the face here on each coffin stood the cobra and the vulture, goddesses of Lower and Upper Egypt. This is probably the most famous item from the tomb, Tutankhamun's death mask. It was found covering the face of the mummy. It's made from 2 sheets of gold joined together by hammering and inlaid with colored glass, turquoise, carnelian, and lapis lazuli. The mask weighs about 22 pounds, and it probably shows an idealized image of Tut's face. The gold alone in this mask is worth about $400,000 in today's gold prices. The burial chamber was not the only room in the tomb with decorated walls. The wall paintings showed scenes from Tut's funeral and his arrival in the underworld. The paintings are simple, and this has led scholars to conclude that the painters worked quickly to limit their time in this very tight space. You can probably see that there are many brown spots on the wall. Carter thought mushroom spores had been introduced either by painting or plastering the walls. And then humidity occurred following evaporation from the plaster, and that permitted their growth. A study done in 2011 shows that the brown color is due to pigment produced by the metabolism of mushrooms, but it could also be from bacteria. Researchers determined that there was no infectious material in the tomb. They figured out the burial chamber was quickly decorated and sealed while the paintings were still wet. When it was completely dry, the microorganisms disappeared and the stains stabilized themselves. So these stains are now considered part of the historical record, and they have not been cleaned. One painting shows 12 baboons that represent the 12 hours throughout the night in which Tutankhamun must pass through before getting into the afterlife. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the painting, you can see that he would use a boat to transport him on his journey. The beetle in the center of the boat represents the sun god, Ra. And these are 11 oars. They were left on the floor of one wall around the shrines to help Tutankhamun navigate his way across the waters of the underworld. 3 years after the discovery of the tomb, experts began a post-mortem on the 3,000-year-old corpse of Tutankhamun. Dr. Douglas Derry, a professor of anatomy from Egyptian University, had to work very carefully because the mummy was fragile. The wrappings had decayed and the mummy was glued so firmly to the coffin that it took 4 days to get it out. The gold death mask was stuck to the head and it had to be removed using hot knives. Only then was the face of the boy king revealed at last. Dr. Derry cut through the outer shroud to peel back the wrappings, and he had to take the body itself apart to remove it from the coffin, and then he had to reassemble it. Unwrapping the head needed special care. He used a fine, soft brush for the last stages. This photograph was taken in 1922 after the bandages had been unwrapped. It was in poor condition compared to other mummies. The skin was badly preserved. It was brittle and gray. Dr. Derry determined that King Tut had been a slim young man, about 18 years old and 5'5" tall. He could not determine the cause of death, but new research has uncovered some dramatic new evidence. X-rays of Tut's body done in 1968 revealed bone fragments in his skull. This photo points to the location, a hole in the base of the skull. There it is. Was this the result of an injury? Some experts use this X-ray to suggest that he was deliberately hit on the head by a political rival who wanted Tut dead. Then more tissue samples, X-ray and CT scans were done in 2005. These images ruled out murder. The hole in his skull was likely made by the ancient embalmers when they recovered the brain as part of the mummification process. Some researchers speculate that bone fragments may have been dislodged also when Carter and his team tried to remove Tut's gold mask, which was so tightly glued to the body. These scientists believe that Tut may have died as a result from a fall from a chariot ride while hunting. The CT scans show a fracture on Tut's left thigh bone and suggest that he broke his leg just before he died and that his death may have resulted from an infection or other complications. With no antibiotics 3,000 years ago, the probability of severe infection resulting from such a break, it could be quite high. Then more tissue samples, X-ray and CT scans were done, and the results were made public in 2014. Tut's body was scanned from head to toe. 1,900 digital X-ray images were created. Scientists examining the body also isolated DNA of the malaria parasite, the oldest such discovery. And that could have been Tut's undoing. The scans also revealed that he had a lot of health problems. He was a frail, weak boy who had a club foot and scoliosis. He needed a cane to walk. In fact, over 130 canes were found inside the tomb. In this photo on the left, you can see Tut holding a cane in his right hand. These scientists say there's no way Tut would have ever been on a chariot because he was too disabled to be able to stand in one. And inbreeding probably created his poor health. This practice of marrying one's relatives in order to keep the bloodline pure. This led to Tut's defects and genetic disorders. So the latest research findings, we have concluded really that his health problems combined with a badly broken leg and a case of malaria are likely what killed him. When Carter's team examined the mummy, they found more than 150 pieces of jewelry on the body itself. The king wore jewelry in life, so why not have plenty of it in the afterlife? Several pieces in this slide are decorated with the sacred scarab, and this was a symbol of eternity, and a scarab amulet was placed over the king's heart in order to protect him against the dangers of the underworld. Beyond the burial chamber was another open doorway leading to a smaller room, and Carter named this room the treasury. Just inside was a jackal on top of the shrine, and this is Anubis, the god of mummification, and he was guarding the room. Behind the jackal were all kinds of containers with jewelry, magical objects, and small gold statues of, Tutankhamun, and lots of gold statues of him, and a variety of Egyptian gods. There were even several model boats here. Carter first looked into the treasury in 1925, but it was more than 3 years before he could start work here. He actually blocked the doorway into the treasury so he wouldn't be distracted while he was working in the burial chamber. Once he started work in this room, they found over 500 objects, and the robbers had reached the treasury room too. They had stolen jewelry and gold figures, but they had not disturbed too much. Inside the treasury was a huge gilded shrine mounted on a gilded wooden sled. It was protected by the figures of 4 goddesses, one on each side of the shrine. This shrine was built to contain the pharaoh's internal organs. The organs were removed during mummification, preserved, and stored in the tomb so the body would be complete in the afterlife. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were dried, wrapped, and stored in 4 containers called kenopek jars. These jars were placed inside this beautiful shrine. A wooden box in the treasury contained 2 small human-shaped coffins. Inside each one was an inner coffin containing a tiny mummy. Investigation showed that these were the mummies of 2 stillborn baby girls, possibly the children of Tutankhamun. And this is one of the many mysteries of him. We really know so little about him, and experts still disagree about who he was. Some think the only outstanding feature of his life was that he died and he was buried. However, I think his life, even though he died when he was still a teenager, his life was not insignificant, because he lived at a time when the religious changes of his father had shaken up the very foundations of Egyptian society. He lived during the period of Egyptian history known as the New Kingdom. We think his father was Akhenaten. Akhenaten's 17-year rule was marked by continuing chaos the pharaoh wanted, because the pharaoh only wanted to worship one god, the sun god, a minor sun god that he called Aten. But the population believed in many gods. At age 30, Akhenaten was probably forced to abdicate the throne, and he died soon afterwards. Tutankhamun was only about 9 years old when he became the new god king. And after his death, Akhenaten was considered to be a heretic, and officials tried to destroy all mention of his name and those of his successors, including Tut. And this may be one of the reasons we know so little about him. Because Tutankhamun was still a child, real control of the kingdom was in the hands of a relative called Ai, and the head of the army, General Horemheb. Both men abolished Akhenaten's order to worship the sun god in favor of the traditional polytheistic beliefs. The same year that Tutankhamun took power, he married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun. When Tutankhamun died at age 19, he had no surviving children. Ankhesenamun contacted the king of the Hittites, asking for one of his sons as a husband for her. The Hittite king sent a candidate, but he died during the journey. He was most likely assassinated by agents of Ai and the general, because they wanted to stay in power. Ankhesenamun later married her relative Ai before disappearing from history. So Howard Carter's work included not only clearing his tomb, but he had to figure out exactly who he was historically, and it took years to do this work. The tomb was discovered in 1922, but it was 1932 before the last of the treasures was safely sent to the museum in Cairo. And that's a full decade of work. Sadly, Lord Carnarvon did not live to see more than the first stages of work in the tomb. In February 1923, a mosquito bite on his cheek became infected. Then he developed pneumonia. He died a couple of months later, His death gave rise to a morbid legend about the curse of the mummy. Journalists reported that a writer called Marie Corelli had predicted that anyone who entered a sealed tomb would be punished. There were other mysterious stories. Cardavant's dog had howled throughout the night of his master's death, and then the dog himself also died. On the same night, an unexplained power failure plunged Cairo into darkness. And on the day the tomb was opened, Carter's canary had been eaten by a cobra. I know, I can tell you're all shocked. Soon, newspapers invented the story of the Pharaoh's curse, which would bring death to anyone entering the tomb. A few people who had visited the site or were connected with the excavation did die shortly afterwards, but most did not. So you're safe. You're safe when you see these tombs. I'm just telling you right now. And in his later years, Carter was often in Egypt, supervising work at the tomb, and he was fine. Howard Carter himself died of a heart attack in 1939, just before his 65th birthday. He was buried in London, and on his tombstone it says, "May your spirit live. May you spend millions of years, you who love thieves, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness." This is the same inscription on the wishing cup of Tutankhamun. With or without a curse, the Valley of the Kings remains one of the most significant archaeological sites in the world. And I hope many of you will be able to visit the valley and explore some of the tombs of the great pharaohs. I'll be back in a few days, and I'm going to give you a talk